Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Here we are at the beginning of my next review series, and to kick things off, I have Wes Craven's original 1984 classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's get into it. A Nightmare on Elm Street is a 1984 film starring Robert Englund, Heather Langenkamp, John Saxon, and is directed by Wes Craven. Teenager Nancy Thompson must uncover the dark truth concealed by her parents after she and her friends become targets of the spirit of a serial killer with a bladed glove in their dreams, in which if they die, it kills them in real life. So, starting with the first major positive of this film is the utilization of its primary villain, Freddy Krueger himself. The number one component that every sequel, even some of the better sequels like Dream Warriors, was missing, in my opinion anyways, was the utilization of Freddy. They tried to lean too hard into the funny side of Freddy, the campy side. Whereas that first movie, Wes Craven truly understood the balance that the character needed to have. Yeah, there was some dark humor in it, but he never leaned too far into that side of Freddy because he understood the most important rule of any horror movie. It doesn't matter what movie it is. You never want your audience to forget that they're supposed to be scared of the villain. You can make a joke out of anything else you want. You can even have funny situations if they're handled right that involve your villain. You just can't ever make a joke out of him. When we get to some of the later sequels, I mean, they make a complete joke out of Freddy. In Freddy's Dead, at one point, he's literally doing a Wizard of Oz parody. And then in another scene, he's basically a Looney Tune. That's not scary. And I'm not really sure who their target audience was because kids couldn't watch that movie. I mean, yeah, they could technically, but that's not your target audience, because there was too much adult subject matter in that movie with the language and the violence. So it wasn't a kid's movie, but it really wasn't for adults either, because I can't think of a single adult who would actually enjoy that movie and ever watch it again on purpose. It was a bad movie. But that was like the worst case scenario. I mean, that movie was the most extreme. But even the other sequels, even Dream Warriors, which I know a lot of people love, a lot of people like it even more than the first one. I don't. But even that movie took the comedy a little too far, in my opinion. But the first movie really had a good balance. Wes Craven understood how to scare an audience and how to create a villain. Him and John Carpenter both. I mean, yeah, they've both had some ups and downs in their filmmaking career, and not every movie was a home run. But the one constant that you could always count on was their ability to create a villain. They both had a good understanding of some very fundamental things. Now, with A Nightmare on Elm Street, it already has a disadvantage over movies like Halloween and the first, the earlier Friday the 13th and a lot of other slashers at that time, in that it's already towing on that line of sensationalism because it's about a dream demon who attacks you in your sleep. Now, that's a double-edged sword. While it is sensational, there is an element of that is frightening, and it's why so many people were frightened of this movie when it first came out. But it does teeter that line of being over the top. And so you have to work even harder to make a movie scary when you're dealing with an already sensational concept. It requires a level of finesse that, quite frankly, a lot of filmmakers don't have. You can see that in this movie's own sequels. They just got increasingly more sensational, and they kept leaning too far into the comedy side, the funny side of Freddy, until ultimately all the ideas were exhausted and the only place left to go was a freaking battle royale with Jason. And yeah, I like that movie, but that's just silly. I mean, in order to get to that point where you're literally having Freddy do spin kicks and karate chopping Jason, you basically had to take the silliest version of both of those characters. And that's honestly why I'm not a big fan of crossover movies like that. And it's not because they're not fun, because I'd be lying if I said they weren't. I did enjoy Freddy vs. Jason. I actually like it quite a bit for what it is. But I want to be scared of these characters. I don't want to be laughing at them. So Yeah, I have to keep that into perspective. That's why I don't champion those movies getting made. But the question is, how do you take an already sensationalized concept and bring it down to earth and ground it out so that it is scary? Well, this first movie gave us the perfect template. So for starters, it introduced the concept of a demon that attacks you in your dreams. We can all relate to nightmares. That is a universal conflict that every single person, or at least 99% of people, I guess there are some people who have like medical conditions where they literally don't dream. I guess it's a medical condition. It may not be necessarily a medical condition, but it's not the norm. But most people dream and most people have nightmares. So that's something we can all relate to. So that's scary. When you feel like you can't sleep because you're just that terrified, that would be a scary concept. It's kind of like what Jaws did to people with the water. I mean, yeah, it's irrational. You shouldn't be afraid to get in your bathtub or take a shower or, jump in a pond, but people were. Well, that's what A Nightmare on Elm Street did to people with going to sleep. I mean, already scary movies have a negative effect on people when it comes to having nightmares anyways, but you combine the added element of a killer who actually literally attacks you in your sleep, in your dreams. That just doubles down on all of that. But then the next part of it is, okay, how do we handle these dream sequences? Because this is where all of the murders take place in this movie. Obviously, you could take the approach that a lot of the sequels did and go way over the top with it and basically make them fantasy fiction, where you've got flying motorcycles and houses falling from the sky and Freddy Krueger on a broomstick. Sure, but that's not scary. I guess there is an element of him pretending to be a witch that was kind of creepy, but not scary. Just a little weird. But by and large, you're not going to terrify anybody with that. And that is what really separated that first movie from all the others. And this may be a very subtle detail to some. It might be something that a lot of people never even really paid a lot of attention to. But if you really pay attention to that first movie and the dream sequences, sure, some of it could have had to do with the budget. It probably had a smaller budget than a couple of, especially the first few sequels, because, like any movie, the sequels are going to subsequently get larger budgets depending on how the movies do. But regardless of what it was, it worked to that movie's advantage because the dream sequences were all very grounded. They weren't on flying motorcycles or people getting sucked into video games. Freddy was invading these people in their comfort zones. Now, what do I mean by that? I guess a good analogy that I can use as an example is take like aliens. I don't know if you believe in them. I don't care. That's not the point of this analogy. Let's say you do believe in aliens. A lot of people do. They're okay with the understanding and their own realization that aliens might exist out there in the universe somewhere. It doesn't bother them because they're out of touch. They're out of reach. They're not in their face. They're not in their backyard. So they don't care. They don't have a lingering fear that keeps them up at night. They're not scared of those things as long as they stay light years away from us. But I guarantee you, if any of those people stepped out of their front door and saw a big UFO hovering over a Walmart Independence Day style, they're going to freak out. Their entire world will get rocked by that because of complete fear. And rightfully so. I mean, I think that would pretty much scare anybody, especially because we've probably seen too many movies on the subject. So when you look back at that first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, where was everybody getting attacked? Okay, Nancy had a dream sequence in her school. Okay, she's at school. She's around friends. She's around teachers. She's around whoever. She felt safe there. That's a comfort zone for most kids. Freddy invaded that. So as soon as he invades that, that's no longer a comfort zone. Where else did he invade her dreams? The bathtub. Everybody takes a shower, takes a bath, hopefully daily. What do you do when you no longer feel safe there? And then the number one of all that I already mentioned earlier, your dreams. Everybody has to fall asleep and everybody's gonna dream. When you don't feel safe there, I don't know what to tell you. Sleeping is like everybody's number one go-to when they've just had it for the day. So what do you do when all of that is stripped away from you? There is a very almost claustrophobic, terrified feeling that would be attached to all of that. And Wes Craven capitalized on all of that when he made A Nightmare on Elm Street. He understood that he needed to make the movie as grounded as possible, otherwise the audience was going to feel disconnected from it, and ultimately they wouldn't be scared. And that's the entire point of a horror movie, is to scare your audience. Yeah, you want them to be entertained, you want them to have a good time, but you want to scare your audience. And if you don't want to do that, then why are you making a horror movie to begin with? But I digress. close. The next part of Freddy's character that Wes Craven completely mastered in this film was understanding that the character needed to remain in the shadows for at least most of the movie. Sure, he was fully exposed in the third act, but by that point the damage was done. You're already completely terrified of this character. You know what he can do and what he's capable of, so it really doesn't matter. But in the earlier parts of the film, all you get are silhouettes or him impersonating other people in the movie. So, if you look at all the best slashers, the villains are utilized in this fashion. Most people would argue that Friday the 13th Part 4 is the best Friday movie. Well, in that movie, Jason is kept in the shadows for most of the movie. It gives your villain this menacing appeal to him. He's frightening. He's the boogeyman. He becomes the thing that you think you see, but you're not sure. And it creates a psychological component with the audience. And this is a trick that all the best filmmakers use. If you look back at all of the greatest slasher movies, Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the best Friday the 13th movies. And obviously plenty more, but I'm not going to list all of them. But you get the point. It makes your villain a blank slate, and because you don't know exactly what he looks like, your imagination starts going to work, and you're using theater of the mind. And generally, your imagination is going to come up with something far scarier than what they can give you on the screen. And this is another example of Wes Craven being a master of his craft. And you can't discuss Wes Craven's skill set as a filmmaker without mentioning his masterful use of practical effects. I don't know if I would put it quite on the level of John Carpenter's The Thing, but it's definitely in the same discussion. Everything from Freddy's makeup to the inventive set pieces and film props they use. One of the scariest scenes of the entire film literally used spandex to bring the scene to life and probably cost $20, which really leaves me scratching my head wondering how 25 years later they recreated this scene with a much bigger budget for the remake and it looks terrible. Another example of practical over CGI every single time. But unfortunately, even this movie didn't get it perfect every single time with the practical effects. There's one scene in particular that really bugs me, but I'll elaborate more on that in my negatives. And moving on to my next positive here is Nancy, and really all the characters, but Nancy was the perfect yin to Freddy's yang. The dichotomy between her and Freddy was done so perfectly in this movie. And honestly, the representation of good versus evil was done as good, if not better here than John Carpenter's Halloween. And both movies really executed it pretty much perfectly. But I think A Nightmare on Elm Street does edge it out just a bit, but only because I like Nancy better than I like Laurie Strode. That's my opinion. I completely understand if you disagree. That's the awesome thing about being a fan. We can all disagree and move on. But Wes Craven really made a very relatable final girl here. And she didn't just feel like any other final girl. She didn't feel like she was just put on screen to go through the motions and make it to the end of this movie. She felt like she earned her victory at the end of the movie. And she was a relatable character. She was a real person with real struggles and things that people really deal with in real life. She had a mom with a drinking problem. Her parents were divorced. She had a rocky relationship with both of her parents. And all of this culminates into a character that you're ultimately rooting for by the end of this movie, and you want to see her victorious over this monster. But then we have Johnny Depp in what I believe was his first role. I mean, I think I read that somewhere or saw that somewhere. It may not be, but it was definitely one of the first, and it wasn't too shabby. I mean, you watch a lot of people's first performances. They're not that good. Like, you can definitely see that, okay, they had some work to do, but he was actually very good. And I like that he doesn't disown that movie. I actually watched a video where he was discussing Wes Craven after he died, and he was very appreciative of Wes Craven and actually said he was very grateful for Wes Craven because he's the one that gave him a chance. He's the one that gave him a shot. Now, he did say it was because of his daughter. His daughter was the one that was like, Dad, you have got to hire him. He's the one that you need. So that was kind of cool seeing that, but he was very appreciative of Wes Craven for giving him a shot in that movie. He wasn't ashamed of doing, a slasher movie. Then, of course, we have John Saxon, which anybody who saw Black Christmas knows who he is even before this movie. And Similar role. I would say I like him and his utilization a little better here because he has a little more to do and his character feels a little more personal to the story because he's Nancy's father. So just a little more important overall to the narrative being told. But I didn't dislike a single character in this movie. Like I said, I think everybody fit their role like a glove. And then you've got the backstory of Freddy, which I almost forgot. I should have explained that earlier when I was talking about how Wes Craven perfected the art of creating a villain. And part of that is the backstory. Now, a lot of times you don't want to know what makes your killer tick because, again, you're towing a line. If you tell too much, you might be answering questions that the audience wasn't asking with answers they don't like. But in this case, it really fleshes Freddy out and he nailed it. And he really didn't give too much. A lot of it was subtext, but basically you have this guy who was killing children in this little town and the parents of the town find out who it is. They track him down and they kill him. Well, his spirit comes back as a demon who invades teenagers in their sleep. I mean, that's the perfect backstory. It tells you everything you need to know while still telling you nothing at all. I mean, you know nothing about who Freddy was as a person other than he was a child killer, which honestly is all you need to know. I mean, at that point, do you really even want to know any more about a person? I mean, you've basically buried the lead with that. And I like that Wes gave Freddy that extra layer of psychotic to his character because, you know, if you wanted to be just very bland and uninspiring with your story, you could just say, yeah, Freddy came back and killed the parents. But no, you want to add the extra psychological layer because if you just kill the parents, sure, you got your revenge, but then what do? No. Whereas mentally and emotionally tormenting the parents is next level sick because on top of already dealing with the fact that your child was murdered, you now have to live with the fact of knowing that your child was murdered all because you killed this man. Now, obviously, they had every right to do what they did, but it just adds an extra psychological component to this movie that makes it even that much scarier to me. But despite how much I do love this movie, it's not without its flaws, and unfortunately, I do have to address one that does stand out to me, and that's the entire final scene of this movie. I hate every second of it. First of all, it feels very campy when the convertible top comes down and it's Freddy's colors. I don't know, just something about that always felt very campy to me and silly. But then you have his arm reaching through the door and grabbing Nancy's mom, and the effects there are just terrible. In a movie where the effects were so good, that's one of the standouts of that movie, is how simple all the effects were, but how effective they were. And then you throw that scene in there, and it ruins, well, there's a lot to hate about that scene, but that's one of the biggest problems there. And then, aside from that, the entire scene is just completely unnecessary. I don't understand why they couldn't have just had the mom waving the kids off and end right there. When you bring Freddy back for that one final gotcha moment, it just cheapens Nancy's victory. Because now you're like, okay, cool, everything she just did was entirely pointless. But to this movie's credit, it was just a product of its time because a lot of movies back then, especially slasher movies, were doing this. It was a cheap gimmick and it was a very bad gimmick, and it's one that I wish had never been invented. But it happened, and unfortunately it put a blemish on an otherwise great film. But for a rating, I'm still going to give this movie a solid 9.5. But that's it for this video, guys. Are you a fan of A Nightmare on Elm Street? Let me know down in the comments section or find me on one of my socials, which are linked in the video descriptions of all my videos. Also, hit the notification so you never miss a video. In the meantime, like and share this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe and I'll catch you guys in the next one.